I should have trusted my gut that night. It wasn't screaming at me. Not yet. But there was this quiet unease I couldn't shake. The party was at my friend Mark's house. One of those casual backyard get-togethers where people drink a little too much, music plays a little too loud, and everyone pretends like they're living the perfect life for a few hours. Stephanie was in a great mood. Too great, honestly. She laughed harder than usual, her hand resting on my arm just a little longer every time she touched me. Overcompensating. That's what it felt like. I didn't say anything, though. I just smiled and played along. Then I noticed him. A man I didn't recognize, standing near the bar, watching Stephanie like he already knew her. He wasn't just looking, he was waiting, and she saw him too. Her eyes flickered toward him, then back to me. It was quick, almost unnoticeable, but I caught it. I was about to ask her who he was when she suddenly grabbed my drink out of my hand. "I'll get us another round," she said, pressing a kiss to my cheek before walking off. But she didn't go to the bar. She walked straight to him. I watched as they exchanged a few quiet words, her body angled slightly toward him. The man leaned in, speaking close to her ear, and I swear I saw the corners of her lips twitch into a nervous smile. Then, just like that, she slipped her hand into his and let him lead her inside. My stomach dropped. I don't know what possessed me in that moment, but I followed them. Not in an obvious way. I waited a few beats, let myself breathe. Then I set my drink down, mumbled something to Mark about using the restroom, and casually made my way through the crowd toward the house. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a friend she hadn't mentioned. But deep down, I knew better, and I was about to find out just how deep this betrayal went. I stepped inside the house, and the noise from the party faded behind me. The place was dimly lit, the warm glow from the kitchen spilling into the hallway. I moved carefully, keeping a few feet of distance as I followed their shadows down the corridor. Stephanie's voice was hushed but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard the nervous edge in her tone. The man, whoever he was, responded in a low, even voice, confident, like he had nothing to worry about. My pulse pounded in my ears. They stopped in front of one of the guest rooms. She glanced over her shoulder, thankfully, not in my direction, before slipping inside. The door didn't shut all the way. I should have walked away. I should have turned around and gone back to the party, convinced myself that I was being paranoid. But I didn't. Instead, I moved closer, careful not to make a sound, and eased myself just near enough to hear. "I told you, this isn't a good idea," Stephanie whispered. "You say that, but you're here," the man replied. Silence. Then the sound of something rustling, paper, maybe? My fingers clenched into fists. "You shouldn't have sent that," she muttered. "You needed to see it," he said. "He deserves to know the truth." I frowned. Who? Who deserved to know? Were they talking about me? Stephanie let out a sharp breath. "Not like this. I have to figure things out on my own. If he sees that, everything will fall apart." My breath hitched. Now I knew for sure. They were talking about me. And that, whatever that was, it was something she didn't want me to see. I peeked through the gap in the door. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He pressed it into her palm. "It's already done," he said. Her hands trembled as she clutched it. And that's when I decided I'd had enough. I stepped forward, pushing the door open with just enough force to make them both jump. Stephanie's eyes widened in sheer panic. The man, however, didn't flinch. He simply turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a second, none of us spoke. Then I looked down, straight at the envelope in her hands. "Go ahead," the man said, a slow smirk forming. "Open it." I had no idea what was inside, but I knew one thing for certain. This was going to change everything. Stephanie's face drained of color. She gripped the envelope so tightly that her knuckles turned white, like she was debating whether to shove it behind her back or rip it apart before I could take it. I didn't give her the chance. "Hand it over," I said, my voice steady. She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the man. Then, without a word, she slowly extended the envelope toward me. I took it. Felt thin, just a single piece of paper inside. My pulse hammered as I tore it open. One glance at the contents, and my whole world tilted. It was a DNA test. My name was on it. So was our son's. And right next to probability of paternity. A glaring, undeniable 0%. My fingers went numb. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. What the hell is this? My voice came out low, almost foreign to my own ears. Stephanie swallowed hard. I can explain. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. My eyes were locked onto the man standing beside her. He still wore that same damn smirk, like he had been waiting for this moment. That's the truth, he said, tilting his head slightly. The truth she never had the guts to tell you. My breath felt like it had been knocked out of my lungs. 3 years. I had spent 3 years raising that boy, believing he was mine. I had held him the night he was born, whispered promises into his tiny ears. I had stayed up with him through fevers, rocked him to sleep when nothing else worked. And now, with a single sheet of paper, all of that had been ripped away. I turned back to Stephanie, my hands shaking. Tell me this isn't real. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. I didn't want her tears. I wanted the truth. How long have you known? I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. She sniffled. How long? Her shoulders slumped. Since he was born. I staggered back a step. She knew. All this time she knew. And she let me believe the lie. I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. Who is it? I asked, my voice ice cold. Who's the father? Stephanie flinched, like she had been dreading the question. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. The smirking bastard beside her. My so-called best friend. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, at Mark, my best friend. The guy who had been in my life for years. The one who had stood beside me at my wedding, toasted to my happiness, even held my son in his arms and called himself Uncle Mark. And all this time, he was the father. A slow, suffocating rage spread through my chest. My fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. Mark just shrugged, still wearing that smug, infuriating smirk. I guess there's no point in denying it now, huh? I wanted to hit him. Hard. Stephanie took a shaky step forward. Please, just listen. I whipped around to face her. Don't. Just don't. I didn't need her lies. I didn't need her excuses. I needed the truth. I turned back to Mark, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. How long? He exhaled, like he was bored with all of this. Since before you two got married. Everything inside me went still. Before we were married. Before I ever said, I do. Before I spent years building a life with a woman who had already chosen someone else. Stephanie let out a choked sob. I thought it was over between us. I was scared. And then I found out I was pregnant, and you let me raise his kid. I cut in, my voice razor sharp. You let me believe I was his father. Tears streamed down her face. I didn't know what to do. I loved you, I still do. Don't you dare say that. Her mouth snapped shut. Mark shook his head, almost amused.
Small man.
You had to suspect something. I mean, you and Stephanie never even looked alike. You really thought that kid was yours. That was it. Before I could think, my fist connected with his jaw. The smirk vanished. Mark stumbled back, cursing, holding his face. What the hell? I grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. You think this is funny? My voice was low, dangerous. You think this is some kind of joke? His hands went up, palms out. Look, I get that you're pissed. I shoved him harder. You don't get anything. Stephanie pulled at my arm, sobbing. Please stop. Don't do this. I turned to her, fury burning in my chest. You don't get to ask me for anything. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then, without another word, I let go of Mark, turned on my heel and walked out. Out of the room, out of the house, out of the life I thought was mine. I don't remember driving home. 1 minute, I was storming out of that house, my head spinning, my chest tight with rage. The next, I was in my driveway, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I just sat there, staring at the house, the home I had built, the place that was supposed to be my safe haven. The place where I had kissed my wife goodnight every evening. The place where I had read bedtime stories to a little boy who wasn't mine. My stomach twisted. I couldn't even bring myself to go inside. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I typed out a message. "We need to talk. Now." I sent it to Stephanie. Not even a second later, the typing bubble appeared. "Please come home. I'm so sorry." Sorry? Sorry for what? For lying to me? For making me believe I had a son? For standing in front of me all these years, looking me in the eyes, and never once telling me the truth? I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I got out of the car and finally forced myself inside. The house was too quiet, too normal. The framed wedding photos on the wall mocked me. The toy truck sitting near the couch made my stomach turn. Every corner of this place held memories. Memories that now felt like they belonged to someone else. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. My hands ran over my face, exhaustion creeping in, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. What was I supposed to do now? I had built my entire life around a lie. And worse, I had fallen in love with a child that wasn't even mine. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't his fault. He was innocent in all of this. He didn't know. To him, I was his dad. I was the one who had kissed his scraped knees, taught him how to throw a ball, held him when he cried. And now, what was I supposed to tell him? Would I just walk away? Pretend like he never mattered? I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. The front door opened. Stephanie stepped inside, her face red and tear-streaked. She hesitated near the doorway, like she was afraid to come any closer. "Say it," I muttered, my voice hollow. She sniffled. "Say what?" "The truth." I lifted my eyes to hers, barely holding it together. "Say it out loud. Say that he's not mine." Her lower lip trembled. She looked down, shaking her head slightly. "I can't," she whispered. "Say it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. He's not yours." Something inside me shattered. I let out a slow breath, nodding. "And you knew, this whole time." She hesitated, but then she gave the smallest nod. I stared at her, searching for even a hint of the woman I thought I knew. The woman I thought I loved. I found nothing. "You destroyed me," I said quietly. She let out a strangled sob, but I didn't care. I stood up, pushing back my chair. "I want a divorce," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
No.
"Please, let's talk." "There's nothing to talk about." I walked past her, heading toward the bedroom. I needed to pack a bag. I needed to get out of here. But as I passed the hallway, my eyes landed on a tiny pair of sneakers by the door. My chest tightened. I wasn't just walking away from her. I was walking away from him, too. And that hurt more than anything else. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at those little sneakers. Everything inside me screamed to leave, to get as far away from Stephanie as possible. But when I thought about walking out of my son's life, no, the boy I raised, I felt something worse than anger. I felt grief. The kind of grief that guts you from the inside out. I heard Stephanie sniffle behind me. "You don't have to leave," she whispered. "We can figure this out." I turned slowly, looking at her like she had lost her mind. "Figure this out?" I repeated, my voice dangerously low. She nodded quickly, desperation in her eyes. "You're his dad in every way that matters. He loves you. You love him. That doesn't have to change." My throat tightened. I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to believe that so badly. But it wasn't true. Because no matter how much I loved that kid, no matter how much he loved me, Stephanie had taken something from me I could never get back. She had taken my choice. I should have been the one to decide whether to raise another man's child. I should have known from the start. But she had made that decision for me. She had built our whole life on a lie. And now, after all this time, she expected me to just accept it? I ran a hand over my face, trying to breathe through the storm raging inside me. "You don't get it, do you?" I said finally. "You don't get what you've done." She stepped forward, her hands reaching for me, but I moved back. "I was supposed to be his father," I choked out. "I spent 3 years believing that. And now I don't even know who I am to him." Stephanie shook her head rapidly. "You're his dad. You're the one who raised him, who—" "I'm not his father," I snapped, my voice cracking. "That's what you just admitted to, right? You knew he wasn't mine from the second you saw that test. But you let me hold him in the hospital, let me sign that birth certificate, let me dream about all the things we'd do together as he grew up." She flinched, her shoulders shaking. "I can't trust you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her face crumbled. "And if I can't trust you, how the hell do we go forward from this?" I didn't wait for an answer. Instead, I walked into the bedroom, grabbed my duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, the essentials. I wasn't even thinking. I just needed to get out. Stephanie lingered in the doorway. "Please don't do this," she begged. I ignored her. She tried again. "What about him? What about our son?" I stopped mid-motion, my hands gripping the edge of the dresser. Our son. Except he wasn't. And yet he was innocent in all of this. He hadn't asked to be born into a lie. He hadn't chosen any of this. I let out a shaky breath and zipped up my bag. "I'll figure it out," I said, not even looking at her. "But I can't stay here." And with that, I walked past her, down the hall and out the door. I don't remember driving to the motel. My mind was a blur, my body moving on autopilot, but somehow, I ended up in a cheap room with a suitcase on the floor and my back against the wall. The weight of it all hit me at once. The betrayal, the humiliation, the loss, because that's what this was, a loss. I wasn't just losing Stephanie. I was losing my son, or whatever he was to me now. I dropped my head into my hands, trying to steady my breath, but nothing helped. The pain was sharp, raw. It burned through me in waves, each one worse than the last. And then my phone buzzed. I hesitated before looking at it. "Stephanie, please come back. We need to talk about him. Stephanie, he keeps asking for you. He doesn't understand." My stomach twisted. Of course, he was asking for me. I was his dad, the only dad he had ever known. And yet, was I? I didn't reply. Couldn't. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my lawyer. He picked up on the second ring.
"Hey, man.
"What's up?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to file for divorce." Silence. Then, a cautious, "What happened?" I clenched my jaw. She lied. About everything. About our son. I heard him sigh on the other end. Damn.
Yeah.
Damn was right. I ran a hand over my face. "I need to know what my rights are. Can I—" My voice cracked, but I pushed through it. "Can I still see him?" Because that was the part that gutted me the most. He wasn't mine, but I loved him. I loved him like he was my own flesh and blood. Could I just walk away from that? "I'll have to look into it," my lawyer said. "If you're on the birth certificate, you have some legal standing. But if you're not his biological father, things can get messy." Messy. As if they weren't already. I swallowed hard. "I don't want to abandon him." "I know," he said. "Let me see what I can do." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, then hung up. The room was dead silent. Just me and my own thoughts. I should have felt relief, at least I was doing something. But instead, all I felt was the crushing weight of what I had just set in motion. A divorce. A custody battle over a child who wasn't even biologically mine. And the slow, painful unraveling of a life I had spent years building. I leaned back against the headboard and stared at the ceiling, exhaustion finally creeping in. What the hell was I supposed to do now? The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and restless nights. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's face. His bright little smile when he ran to me after work, the way he called me daddy without hesitation. But now I was just some guy to him. Or at least that's what the law might decide. My lawyer called me 2 days after I left the house. "I've gone through your documents," he said. "You're on the birth certificate, which means you have parental rights. But if Stephanie fights this, it could get ugly." Of course, she would fight. I knew her. She wasn't going to just let me have shared custody of Mark's kid. "She wants me out of his life, doesn't she?" I asked. A long pause. "She hasn't said that outright, but she's not exactly making it easy." I let out a humorless laugh. "Of course not." Because despite her crying, despite her apologies, she had already started erasing me from my own son's life. I wasn't going to let her. "I want to fight for him," I said, my voice firm. "I don't care what it takes." My lawyer sighed. "Then prepare yourself. Because this isn't going to be about what's fair. It's going to be about what the court thinks is best for the child." That's what scared me the most. Would they see me as his father? Or just a man who had been tricked into raising someone else's kid? That night, I sat in my motel room, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of the three of us, laughing, celebrating birthdays, cuddled up on the couch. All fake. I was so lost in my head that I almost didn't hear the knock at the door. I frowned. No one knew where I was staying except my lawyer. I opened the door, and there he was, my son, holding Stephanie's hand. I froze. My chest tightened. He looked up at me, confused. "Daddy, why aren't you home?" I had to swallow hard to keep my voice steady. "Hey, buddy." I crouched down, forcing a smile. I glanced at Stephanie, my jaw clenching. "What are you doing here?" She shifted awkwardly. "He's been asking for you nonstop. I thought—" She trailed off. "I thought maybe you could talk to him." My heart twisted. I looked at my son, the boy I raised, the boy I loved. He had no idea his world was about to change. And I had no idea how to break his heart. I stared at him, this little boy who knew nothing of the storm raging around him. To him, I was still Daddy, the same man who carried him on my shoulders, who made his pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs, who kissed his forehead every night before bed. But how long before that changed? Before Stephanie told him the truth? Before Mark stepped in to take my place? I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a smile. "Hey, buddy." He beamed. "Can we go home now?" Stephanie tensed beside him, and my stomach twisted. He didn't understand. He had no clue why I left, why I couldn't just come back. And I couldn't bring myself to tell him. Not yet. I glanced at Stephanie. "Can I have a few minutes alone with him?" She hesitated, but then nodded. "I'll wait in the car." As she walked away, I stepped aside, letting him into the motel room. It was small, depressing, not the home he knew. He climbed onto the bed and kicked his little feet, completely unaware of how much my heart was breaking. "Why are you here, Daddy?" he asked. I sat beside him, running a hand down my face. How the hell was I supposed to do this? I had to go away for a little while," I said carefully. His little brows scrunched. "Did I do something bad?" The breath hitched in my throat.
No.
"No, buddy, you didn't do anything wrong." I took his tiny hand in mine, squeezing it. "This isn't about you, okay? It's—" My voice cracked. "It's just something between me and Mommy." His lower lip wobbled. "Are you mad at Mommy?" I exhaled slowly. "Yeah, buddy, I am." He blinked up at me, eyes wide and full of innocent confusion. He had no idea that the foundation of his life had been built on a lie. And right now, he didn't need to know. He just needed his dad. So I did the only thing I could do. I pulled him into my arms and held him. He clung to me, his little fingers gripping my shirt. And for a moment, I just sat there, inhaling the scent of his shampoo, feeling his warmth against me, memorizing this. Because I had no idea how much longer I'd have it. After a while, Stephanie knocked on the door. It was time. I walked him to the car, my steps heavy. As he climbed into his booster seat, he looked up at me. "You'll come home soon?" I hesitated. Then I forced a smile. "I'll see you soon, buddy." He nodded, satisfied with that answer. But as Stephanie pulled away, and I stood there watching them disappear down the road, I felt it in my gut. Nothing would ever be the same again. and I had no idea if I'd ever truly be his father again. The moment Stephanie's car disappeared down the road, the weight of it all came crashing down on me. I had just looked into my son's eyes. My son, no matter what the DNA said, and lied to him. I had told him I'd see him soon, but the truth was, I didn't know when, or how, or if I even had the legal right to. I knew one thing, though. I wasn't going to let Stephanie decide that for me. I went straight back to my motel room and called my lawyer. "She brought him to see me today," I said as soon as he picked up. "He doesn't understand what's happening. He still thinks I'm his dad." "Because you are," my lawyer said. "DNA doesn't change that. But the law might." My voice was tight. "I need to know exactly where I stand." I heard him shuffling papers on the other end. "Since you're on the birth certificate, you have legal paternity. But here's the issue: Stephanie could file to have it revoked based on the DNA test. If she pushes for full custody and argues that Mark is the biological father, the court might rule in her favor." I clenched my jaw. "So what do I do?" Silence. Then, carefully, my lawyer said, "The best move? File for shared custody before she files anything." I nodded, already making up my mind. "Then let's do it." 2 days later, I got a text from Stephanie. "We need to talk. In person." I almost ignored it, but I knew this conversation was inevitable. We met at a quiet coffee shop. She was already at a table when I walked in, nervously stirring her drink. Her eyes flicked up to mine. "Thank you for coming." I sat down without a word. She sighed. "Look, I know you're angry. Angry doesn't even begin to cover it." She flinched but didn't argue. After a moment, she whispered, "Are you really filing for custody?" I leaned forward, my hands clasped together. "I don't want to fight, Stephanie, but you don't get to erase me from his life. I raised him. I love him. He's my son." Tears welled in her eyes. "But he's not." Her words felt like a slap. I took a slow breath, my voice steady. "He might not share my DNA, but I am his father in every way that matters. And I will fight for him." Stephanie wiped at her eyes. "And what if the court decides otherwise? What if they rule that Mark," she swallowed, "should be the one to raise him?" The thought sent a cold wave of panic through me. I gritted my teeth. "Then I'll fight harder." Stephanie exhaled shakily. "I don't want a court battle, but Mark, he does. He thinks it's time for the truth to come out." My hands curled into fists under the table. Of course, Mark wanted that. He had waited years for this moment. "Mark doesn't get to decide anything," I snapped. "He wasn't there for him. I was." Stephanie looked away. "I know, but that doesn't change the facts." I stood up. "You're right. Facts don't change. But neither does love." And with that, I walked out. I had a custody battle to prepare for, and I wasn't going to lose. The custody battle was officially underway. My lawyer wasted no time filing the paperwork, making it clear that I was seeking joint custody of my son. Because no matter what Stephanie or Mark thought, I wasn't just going to disappear. Stephanie, however, had other plans. A few days after filing, my lawyer called me with an update. "She's contesting your petition," he said, his tone tense. "Her lawyer is arguing that since you're not the biological father, maintaining custody would confuse the child, and that the court should recognize Mark as the legal parent." I gripped the phone tighter. "And what are my chances of winning?" "It depends. Judges tend to favor biological parents unless you can prove that cutting you out would be harmful to the child's well-being." I already knew that answer. Of course, it would be harmful. I had been his dad since birth. But proving that in court? That was another battle entirely. "Can Mark even file for custody?" I asked. "He's not on the birth certificate, so technically, he has no legal standing yet. But if Stephanie supports his claim, the court might allow him to file for paternity rights." I let out a bitter laugh. "So the man who abandoned him for years suddenly wants to be a father, and the court might just let him?" "That's how the system works," my lawyer said. "But don't lose hope. You have something he doesn't." I rubbed my temple. "What's that?" He hesitated. "Time. You've been there for 3 years. That matters." I hung onto those words like a lifeline. A week later, I got a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the bar on 5th. Mark." I stared at the message, debating whether to ignore it. But something told me he wasn't going to go away, so I decided to face him head-on. When I walked into the bar, he was already there, sitting at a booth with a smug look on his face. I slid into the seat across from him. "If you're here to gloat, save it." He smirked. "Relax, man. I just wanted to have a civil conversation." I clenched my jaw. "There's nothing civil about what you did." He exhaled, leaning back. "Look, I get it. You're pissed. But this was always going to come out eventually. You can't seriously think you're going to win this." I narrowed my eyes. "I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting for my son." Mark scoffed. "He's not your son." A sharp, blinding rage shot through me. I gritted my teeth, gripping the edge of the table to stop myself from lunging at him. "He doesn't even know who you are," I said, my voice dangerously low. "You had 3 years to be in his life, and you chose to stay in the shadows. And now you suddenly care." Mark shrugged. "I wasn't ready before, but I am now." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, you're ready? Well, good for you. But guess what? I was ready from day one." His smirk faltered. I leaned forward. "You think biology makes you a father? It doesn't. It takes showing up. It takes being there. And that's something you've never done." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's going to change." I shook my head. "No, Mark. You don't just get to waltz in and replace me. That's not how this works." He crossed his arms. "The court might see it differently." I met his gaze, unwavering. "Then I guess we'll see who the court thinks is the real father." I stood up and walked out, leaving him sitting there, stewing. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about proving who had truly earned the title of dad. And I wasn't going to lose. The court date was set. In just a few weeks, a judge would decide whether I still had the right to be in my son's life, or if Mark, the man who had abandoned him for years, would be granted full parental rights. The weight of it pressed down on me every second of the day. I spent hours with my lawyer, preparing for everything. We gathered evidence, photos, videos, school records, medical documents, all showing that I was the one who had been there since the beginning. But deep down, I knew none of that guaranteed anything. The law didn't care about emotions, cared about facts. And the fact was, I wasn't his biological father. Would that be enough to erase me? A few nights before the court date, Stephanie showed up at my motel. I opened the door, exhausted from another sleepless night, and just stared at her. "What do you want?" She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. "I don't want to do this, you know," she whispered. I crossed my arms. "Then don't." She looked down, wringing her hands. "Mark is pushing for full custody. He wants to be in his son's life." I scoffed. "Oh, now he wants that? After 3 years of being a ghost?" Stephanie flinched. "He made a mistake. But he's ready now." I clenched my fists. "And what if I'm not ready to just step aside?" Tears welled in her eyes. "That's why I'm here. I don't want this to go to court. I don't want a judge deciding what happens." I narrowed my eyes. "So what are you saying?" She inhaled shakily. "Drop the custody case. Walk away. And in return, I won't fight you on visitation." I felt my pulse in my ears. "You expect me to just trust you?" She wiped at her face. "I don't want to keep him from you. But if we go to court and the judge sides with Mark, you could lose everything. This way you still get to see him, just not as his father." The words "not as his father" cut through me like a blade. I turned away, gripping the edge of the dresser to keep myself from shaking. "And if I say no?" Stephanie's voice was small. "Then we let the court decide." I squeezed my eyes shut. She was giving me an out, a safe out. A way to stay in my son's life without the risk of losing him completely. But it would mean surrendering. It would mean accepting that I was nothing more than an outsider. Could I do that? Could I look my son in the eye and be less than what I had always been to him? I exhaled slowly and turned back to Stephanie. "No," I said firmly. Her lip trembled. "Please. No." I repeated. I'm not just some visitor in his life. I'm his dad. And I'm going to fight like hell to keep it that way. Stephanie let out a broken sob, but I didn't care anymore. I had made my choice. I wasn't backing down. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. I walked into the courtroom in a suit that felt too tight, my heart pounding in my chest. Across the room sat Stephanie and Mark. She looked tense, her hands clasped in her lap, while Mark had that same smug expression he always wore, like he had already won. I clenched my jaw. Not today. Not ever. My lawyer leaned in. Stay calm, answer honestly, and don't let emotions control you. We have a strong case. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I believed him. This judge was about to decide if I was still a father, or if I had spent the last 3 years living a lie. Mark's lawyer went first. Your Honor, this case is simple. My client, Mark, is the child's biological father. He is ready to step into his rightful role. While we acknowledge that the petitioner, his eyes flicked toward me, has played a role in the child's life, that does not change the fundamental truth. Biology matters. A child should be raised by his real father. I gritted my teeth. Then Mark himself spoke. He played the part well, regretful, ready to take responsibility. I made mistakes, he admitted, looking down like he was ashamed. But I want to fix them. I want to be in my son's life. And I don't think it's fair for another man to keep me from that. I nearly laughed at the hypocrisy. The judge turned to me. Do you have a response? I stood up, keeping my voice steady. Your Honor, I'm not trying to keep him from his son, but I am his father, too. I have been since the day he was born. I was the one who fed him at night, held him when he cried, taught him his first words. Being a father isn't just about DNA. It's about showing up. I turned to Mark, my eyes burning. Where were you when he took his first steps? When he had nightmares? When he needed someone to tell him everything would be okay? Mark shifted uncomfortably. I exhaled sharply, looking back at the judge. I may not share his blood, but I share his life, and that should count for something. Then came the moment I wasn't ready for. Stephanie took the stand. At first, she seemed torn, like she wanted to be fair. But then Mark's lawyer pressed her. Do you believe the petitioner should remain in the father role? Stephanie hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. I felt the air leave my lungs. She wouldn't even fight for me. Her voice was soft. I don't want to take him away from his life, but he should know the truth. And I believe it's best if Mark takes over as his father. I stared at her, stunned. After everything, after all the years I gave her, after every sacrifice I made for our family, she was choosing him. The judge nodded, scribbling something down. I felt like I was losing already. Then my lawyer stood. Your Honor, if I may? The judge gestured for him to proceed. He turned to Stephanie, his voice sharp but calm. Do you believe it would be harmful for your son to lose contact with the petitioner? Stephanie hesitated. I don't know. He nodded. Would you say your son loves him? Her lip trembled. Yes. My lawyer turned to the judge. Your Honor, we are not arguing biology. We are arguing bonding, stability, and emotional well-being. Stripping my client of his parental role would not only devastate him but would also harm the child. This is not about replacing a father. It's about making sure a child doesn't lose one. The judge's face remained unreadable. Then he spoke. I will take this under consideration and issue a ruling soon. And just like that, it was over. Now all I could do was wait. The waiting was unbearable. Days stretched into a week, and every second felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I barely ate, barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, thinking it was the court's decision. And then, finally, it came. I sat in my lawyer's office, hands clenched into fists, as he opened the envelope. His expression was unreadable. Then he looked up at me. You got partial custody. I exhaled sharply, my whole body releasing the tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. I wasn't erased. I wasn't replaced. I wasn't just some guy who used to be his dad. I was still there. It wasn't everything I wanted. I wouldn't be there for every bedtime, every scraped knee, every lazy Sunday morning making pancakes. But I would still be in his life. And that was enough. For now. The first time I picked him up under the new custody agreement, he ran straight into my arms, just like always. Daddy! His little voice shattered something inside me. I lifted him up, holding him tight. I didn't care what the court said, what the papers said, what biology said. I was his dad. I would always be his dad. And no one, not Stephanie, not Mark, not even the law, could take that away from me. Because love isn't in blood. It's in showing up. And I wasn't going anywhere.